Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 25, Home from Hospital. So Eric, how long were you in hospital and when did you go home?
I was in hospital for about 18 months, and it was in June 1944 that Sister came into the ward where the teacher was giving us our usual hard time in endeavouring to teach us some maths, and told us to put our pencils down while she spoke to us. And she told us that because of the increased bombing in London, and in particular the doodle bugs or the V1 flying bombs that Germany was now sending over, the hospital, or the patients anyway, were being evacuated up to Durham. Well, none of us kids had any idea what Durham was, but some of the kids thought that because I had travelled to Wales, I ought to know where Durham was, which of course was totally untrue. Then later, Sister called me into her office and said that the doctors had decided that they could do no more for me, that my semi-paralysed arm and smashed ankle and the consequences of that were incurable. So I was going home. So while the rest of the patients were going up to Durham to safety, I was sent back to London, right where the flying bombs, the doodle bugs, were falling. And I was sent to that part of southeast London, which was known as Doodlebug Alley. I wondered afterwards if the real reason for us being evacuated up to Durham was less our safety concerns, but because they wanted a hospital with all that facilities closer to the south coast to treat the wounded soldiers and servicemen, rather than having them go all the way up to Durham. But anyway, on the appointed day, I packed up my meagre possessions in a carrier bag and was taken out to a small coach that was taking a few other children and myself back to various hospitals in London. I was returned to Lewisham Hospital for my mother to come to meet me and collect me to take me home. So I went back to the hospital where I first started my trek round the 5 hospitals that I eventually went to. When I arrived at Lewisham Hospital, they decided that the clothes I was wearing at the time were the hospital's. My own clothes had been more or less cut off and bundled away when I was first injured and taken to hospital immediately after the bombing of the school. So because I was wearing hospital clothes, they wanted them back. So I was putting in a small cubicle with just curtains around, wearing just a flimsy dressing gown that was too small for me anyway. So the nurse who was supposed to look after me said, well, that's all right. We'll put the dressing gown on back to front, so you're covered up properly. Well, that was all right. I was covered up properly, provided I either stood with my back to the wall or sat down. She popped in from time to time for the few hours that I was there, until I heard a half-familiar voice out in the hallway asking for me. The curtain was pulled aside, and there was this half-familiar woman and a small kid that I didn't know at all. And she said, chattering away, that she'd only got the telegram to say I was coming home the night before, and she'd been rushing around all morning to try and sort out a ration book for me, clothing coupons, and buy me a set of clothes. So she started to whip off the dressing gown, and I said, you can't do that. Who's that kid there with you? My mother said that that was Eddie, my small brother, and brushed aside my modesty and got me dressed. And then all of a sudden, I was whipped away from my familiar setting of hospitals and nurses and wards and things, and going off with a strange woman, a strange kid, into a strange future. And as my mother took me out of the hospital gates, I remember that I was feeling really homesick. Not homesick for the place she was taking me to. That wasn't home to me. It was the hospital that was home to me. We travelled home on a bus, and there was this kid sitting on this woman's knee, just staring at me, while the woman, the mother, chatted away to me about stuff I don't remember. When we got home, I was taken down to the back garden where our shelter was, that I vaguely remembered. And then she started trying to sort out how we were going to sleep in it, because my family was sleeping every night in the shelter. My mother and father were on beds on the floor of the shelter, and Eddie was sleeping on part of a cot that stretched from one side wall to the other, resting on the ledges. I then tried to puzzle out where to fit me, because of course I was bigger than Eddie and they didn't have another cot spring anyway. And then I had a brilliant idea, the way to solve all our problems. Mum, I said, why not take me back to the hospital? They've got loads of beds there. And I thought this was brilliant, because it would mean my mother wouldn't have to bother about sorting out a bed for me in the shelter. It will mean I will be back in my familiar setting of hospitals and wards, and I wouldn't have to spend the rest of my life with this woman that I barely knew and this kid. And my mother had mentioned my father around somewhere, and I couldn't remember him at all. But my mother said, no, I'll work out how to fit you in here. In the end, what she did was to borrow another cot spring from a neighbour, and had to sew canvas straps around as additional support, because just the cot itself wouldn't have taken my weight. She was still sorting that out when this other stranger, a man, pushed his head in through the door, kneeling down at the shelter, and he said, "You're home then?" And then he vanished. And that was the greeting I got from my father. Eventually I settled down, of course, and then Eddie and I started a new thing. We would sit on top of the shelter. One of us would wear a toy helmet, and the other would have a toy telescope, and we'd be keeping our eyes open for doodle bugs. One day an aunt came to see us, which was very rare indeed. She lived the other side of London. And partway through her visit, Eddie and I was our usual post on the shelter watching out for doodle bugs. And one came across, its engine chattering away. Eddie immediately dashed in and shouted out, "Doodle bug coming, doodle bug coming." And my aunt dashed down to the garden and dived into the shelter, my mother following much more slowly. And by then, of course, the doodle bug had gone by, its engine still working. And my mother said to my aunt in a freezing tone of voice, "We never show fear in front of the children."
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.